Okay, so this tutorial looks at data entry in SPSS. I'm gonna be using a questionnaire, the one that you guys would have used in class, to show you how to set up this questionnaire in SPSS. So this is a tool that was used in data collection. That data has been collected and persons would have selected each category. The respondents would have selected the different categories that relate to their answers, the answers that they want to provide. Now, we're going to get this questionnaire into SPSS and then get each of the respondents, each of the responses rather, into the software as well. Now, if you take a time, about 5 seconds or so just to browse through the types of questions on the questionnaire, you'll realize that there are several types of questions on this questionnaire. Most of the questions are actually represented categorically. The responses are represented categorically. So we have where do you live, for example, that's represented in two categories. What we call a dichotomous nominal variable. So is gender. But we also have other types of questions that are represented on the ratio scale. So things like age, where I'm asking a raw value for age. Here it is represented on the ratio scale. This is a 5-level categorical question, or rather 6-level categorical nominal question. Going down here, we can see where we have some ordinal questions, for example, where I rank feelings about the variety of food on campus along this kind of Likert scale, moving from more than adequate to inadequate. So it's a 4-point ordinal scale. I also have questions that are a little bit more complex in their data entry format. Here is one question that is what we call a multiple response question. It asks for the two most important reasons from the options below. Now for this video, I will not be dealing with multiple response data entry for this video, but you can find the video that relates specifically to multiple response further down in the YouTube channel. Now, so how do we get from this questionnaire that's in Microsoft Word to SPSS? Now I'm gonna just enter I'm just gonna set up maybe 2 or 3 other questions just to show you guys the correct procedure. Now this is the SPSS window. And SPSS generally produces, sorry, that's not it. SPSS has 2 main windows. It has the data editor window, which is this one, it looks a lot like maybe a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet. And there's also an output window. In the output window, this is the output window, and what it does, it shows you the syntax for the various commands that have been executed in SPSS, and also it shows the output for those commands. So it will show you graphs, charts, tables for the various statistical tests that you may have done. If you have instructed the software to, for example, generate a crosstab that shows the relationship between age and maybe not in this case. You wouldn't use age in this case because it's not a categorical variable, but gender and choice of food outlet, for example, then that would be useful. You could also, I'm going to show you in a few seconds as well, how to do some graphs. So that's the output window, and that's and the other window is called the data editor window. Now this is the most important window because what we do in the data editor window will determine what happens in the output window and ultimately the results or how we interpret our stuff. Now the data editor window has 2 tabs. The first tab is called the data view, which is represented here, and the second tab, the variable view. Now it is in the variable view that you set up the attributes for each. You need to tell the software what the different characteristics are for each variable. Now let's jump back to the data view for a second. In the data view, each variable, and in this case I'm using each question would represent a different variable in this case for the assignment that we're working on now. So question 1 which let me just remind you of question 1. Where do you live? On campus, off campus? That all of that data would be represented in this VAR column. Now, variables are expressed column-wise, and cases, and in this case, our cases represent respondents to the questionnaire. Each respondent would be represented by one by a row. So let us go to the variable view to set up our software so it can deal with the data that we need to enter. Now, so for the first attribute or parameter for the variable is the name, and the best thing to do is to give it a very short abbreviated name. In this case, since the variable was where do you live, let's call it residence. I'm gonna just type in the box residence, and I also like to put the number of the question right beside it. So I like to call it residence 1. The question number is important because sometimes we can get a bit confused when variables have similar names. So you may have more than one variable on your questionnaire that looks at residence. So it's always useful to include the question number at the end of that variable. Now, when that is entered, the other fields are automatically populated, but these fields will have to be changed. So, for example, in this case, you're dealing with the type of variable. The type of variable we have here, although it's essentially a qualitative variable, we are going to call it a numeric variable because it is coded. We have assigned a numeric code of 1 to off-campus students and a numeric code of 2 to on-campus students, and that is necessary because it will make data entry much easier, and certainly in terms of how the statistical test will work in terms of grouping the data, it is a more appropriate way of assigning these codes. So if our data was if we wanted to use alphabetical characters, for example, and we wanted to type out stuff, instead, we would use string, but in more often than not, you will be required to enter your data as numeric data. And of course, there are several this dialog box for variable type gives you several other options of data types that you can use. You can also, change the width and the decimals from this window. So I'm gonna leave it at numeric since I'm using numeric codes, 1 for off-campus and 2 for on-campus. Now, width, this is highly dependent on the number of characters that you expect that you want the data entered. You want it to the number of characters that it can accommodate. So I'm gonna leave that at the default of 8. Since these are discrete categorical variables, and the coding is also using discrete numbers. They're really using whole numbers. So I'm not going to use any decimals. It's not necessary. Even if you leave it at 2 decimals, it will not make a difference. Now, in the label column, this is where you would enter the name of the variable in more detail. This is what will come out when you're doing your graphs and your charts, but because the name column here cannot accommodate things like spaces, this gives you the opportunity to provide that type of detail. So you can probably type here place of residence. Right. Now, in the values column, this is very important. The values column, this is where you assign meaning to your numeric codes. Now, in the values column, I'm gonna type 1 for off-campus, and I'm gonna call it off-campus. So that represents off-campus students, and 2 for on-campus students as place of residence. Now, what this will mean is that wherever I type 1 in that spreadsheet, that field will be populated with on-campus, or with off-campus, I'm sorry. Let me just double check that. Right, 1 is off-campus, 2 on-campus. And wherever I type 2, that field will be populated with on-campus. Now, the missing values, that's important because in some cases, we need to define our missing values because depending on the statistical tests we do, it may count in some situations a blank column, a blank field as zero, and it can of course affect overall outcomes. We don't want that. What we do here is assign